Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed. Fear still masqueraded as virtue. Power still convinced itself it was right, but occasionally, just occasionally, observation and patience were enough to restore what had been broken. Outside, the roses stood quietly in the dark, their petals untouched, their thorns unchanged, and Miss Marple, ever gentle, ever watchful, prepared herself once more for a world that would never stop needing her kind of attention. The days that followed settled over little Hawthorne with a strange mixture of relief and discomfort, like sunlight after a storm that reveals more damage than expected. Life resumed outwardly at least. Shops reopened at their usual hours. The church bells rang on Sunday with their familiar steadiness. Teacups clinked again on saucers, yet beneath the routines lay a quiet awareness that something fundamental had shifted. The village had looked closely at itself and had not entirely liked what it saw. Harriet Bell remained at the doctor's house for several days. Strength returned slowly, carried by warm broth, clean linens, and the gentle reassurance of people who now spoke to her as a person rather than a servant. When she finally walked through the village again, heads turned not with curiosity this time, but with something closer to remorse. Some smiled too quickly. Others avoided her eyes. Miss Marple walked beside her part of the way. "You needn't hurry," she said softly when Harriet slowed. "I'm afraid I might still be in trouble," Harriet admitted. "No, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "You are no longer invisible. That makes all the difference." Inspector Pierce completed his report with care, mindful not only of fact, but of the fragile dignity of a village that would have to live with them. Lady Evelyn's actions were recorded plainly: unlawful confinement, intimidation, abuse of authority, stripped of sentiment or excuse. There was no dramatic confession, no moment of villainous rage, only the slow unraveling of a woman who had believed order gave her the right to control others. When Pierce visited Miss Marple one final time, he looked both exhausted and thoughtful. "You were right from the beginning," he said, "about the village choosing comfort over truth. It is a very human tendency," she replied. "And about Harriet not being dead." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Death is noisy in its own way. Silence is much more frightening." He hesitated. "You never accused Lady Evelyn directly?" "No," Miss Marple said. "People rarely listen when accused. They listen when allowed to reveal themselves." Pierce nodded slowly, understanding at last. In the weeks that followed, little Hawthorne adjusted itself. Some relationships cooled. Others strengthened quietly. The villagers spoke less freely of certainty and more carefully of assumptions. It was not a transformation, exactly. Villages were slow to change, but a soft correction, like a stitch pulled tighter where fabric had begun to fray. Colonel Baxter resumed his walks, his voice no longer booming quite so loudly. Mrs. Grant grew gentler in her observation. Mrs. Alder left Hawthorne House and found work elsewhere, carrying both guilt and relief with her. Harriet chose not to remain in the village. On her final afternoon, she visited Miss Marple's cottage to say goodbye. She stood in the doorway, posture straighter than it had ever been before. "I'm going to the coast," she said. "My sister has friends there." "That sounds very sensible," Miss Marple said. Harriet hesitated. "You believed me before anyone else did." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I believed what people showed me. That's all." Harriet smiled, then left. Not hurried this time, not afraid, but purposeful. When she was gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. Outside, the village moved as it always had. Children passed on bicycles. A dog barked in the distance. Life continued, imperfect, persistent. Yet Miss Marple knew something important had been revealed, even if it would never be spoken aloud. The crime had not been born of rage or desperation, but of entitlement. Lady Evelyn had not seen herself as cruel. That, Miss Marple reflected, was the most dangerous thing of all. When people believe they are right, they stop questioning what they do to others. Authority becomes morality. Control becomes kindness. And that was why Harriet had been locked away, not in hatred, but in righteousness. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. It was a pattern she had encountered many times across her long life. Different houses, different faces, same quiet certainty that power knew best. She rose and placed the yarn back in its basket. Outside, roses climbed once more along the garden trellis, their blooms perfect and fragrant. Visitors would admire them again next spring, praising little hawthorn's charm and order. They would not see the thorns unless they looked closely. Miss Marple did, and she always would. Because evil, she knew, rarely announced itself with darkness or fury. More often, it arrived politely, convinced of its own correctness, and waited for someone patient enough to notice. The village of Little Hawthorn prided itself on two things above all else: its roses and its reputation. Both were carefully tended, trimmed just so, and spoken of with a quiet certainty that bordered on smugness. Visitors often remarked on the calm that seemed to rest over the place like a well-pressed linen cloth. Nothing improper ever happened in Little Hawthorn, or so everyone liked to believe. On the afternoon of the spring garden fete, the village looked its most convincing. White bunting fluttered between apple trees behind St. Agnes Church. Tables were laid with starched cloths and mismatched china brought lovingly from cupboards reserved for special occasions. The air carried the scent of cut grass, warm sponge cake, and the faint bitterness of overbrewed tea. Laughter drifted gently, polite and restrained, never too loud. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart from the bustle, her knitting resting lightly in her lap. She wore a pale blue hat trimmed with artificial flowers that had seen many seasons, and her gloved hands moved with calm precision. From where she sat, she could see nearly the entire green without appearing to watch anything at all. People rarely noticed that sort of thing. They assumed age dulled attention rather than sharpening it. She observed Mrs. Whitcomb hovering anxiously over the cake stall, straightening slices that had already been aligned 3 times. She noted Colonel Baxter's booming voice, which rose whenever silence threatened. She saw young Eleanor Fitch blush deeply after dropping a plate, and the way her aunt's lips pressed thin with irritation. And near the refreshment tent stood Harriet Bell. The girl could not have been more than 20. She wore the neat black uniform of a maid, her apron stiff with starch, her hair pinned so tightly it pulled at her temples. She held a teapot in both hands, yet her posture was rigid, as though bracing for something unseen. Her eyes moved constantly, not toward the guests she served, but toward the far hedgerow that bordered the green. Miss Marple noticed this at once. People who are content remain where they are. People who are frightened look for ways out. Lady Evelyn Hawthorn, Harriet's employer, stood beside her, elegant and upright in a lavender dress. She accepted her tea with barely a glance at the girl and turned instead to Inspector Daniel Pierce, who had attended the fete out of courtesy more than duty. Such a comfort, Lady Evelyn was saying, to see things return to normal after last winter. Inspector Pierce murmured agreement. Miss Marple, as Needles paused for half a second, after last winter. The phrase lingered oddly in her mind. It was the sort of remark people used when something unpleasant had occurred but had never been properly discussed. Villages were very good at sealing memories away behind pleasant expression. The church clock chimed 3:30. Conversation swelled again. A child laughed. Someone applauded as the raffle winner was announced. For a few minutes, nothing appeared amiss. Then Mrs. Whitcomb frowned. "Wasn't the maid just here?" she said, peering toward the tent. The dark-haired girl. Lady Evelyn glanced around, irritation flickering. "Harriet," she called, not loudly. "Harriet." There was no reply. At first, no one thought much of it. Maid stepping away was hardly cause for concern, but when several minutes passed and she did not return, murmurs began threading through the crowd. Lady Evelyn's voice sharpened. She's probably wandered off without permission. Inspector Pierce set down his teacup. "I'll have a look." As people shifted and craned their necks, Miss Marple noticed the abandoned teacup on the table, filled only halfway, steam long gone, milk untouched. It struck her as peculiar. Few servants abandoned tasks mid-pour unless called away suddenly or expecting to return almost at once. Her gaze drifted again toward the hedgerow. Earlier she was quite certain something had moved there. Not now, but before the fuss began. The search began casually and then gradually with increasing tension. A few men walked the lanes. Someone checked behind the church. The laughter of the fete faded, replaced by uncomfortable silence and speculative whispers. By the time the sun dipped lower, Harriet Bell had not been found. At Hawthorne House, her small attic room was discovered to be immaculate. Her clothes were folded, her modest savings still tucked carefully inside a tin beneath the bed. Letters lay half-written on the desk. Nothing suggested a planned departure. Only her coat was missing. She wouldn't leave her wages, Mrs. Everly insisted, clasping her handbag tightly. Not a sensible girl like that. She was devoted to her sister, the vicar's wife, added. Always talking about sending money home. Lady Evelyn sat stiffly in her drawing room, fingers clenched in her lap. She had no reason to go, she said firmly. None at all. Inspector Pierce stood by the fireplace, his expression thoughtful rather than convinced. People don't vanish without cause, he said quietly. The words slipped into the room like a draft. Murder, Lady Evelyn recoiled. That's absurd. But no one quite agreed aloud. Miss Marple sat near the window, her knitting still in hand. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, but recognition. Years earlier, another girl in another village had disappeared just as neatly. Everyone had said she'd run away too. She cleared her throat. You know, she said gently, girls rarely run away without telling someone, especially when they care deeply for someone else. Several heads turned toward her, politely puzzled. Then the moment passed. Miss Marple was, after all, only Miss Marple. Inspector Pierce, however, lingered on her words. Outside, dusk crept across the rose beds, lengthening shadows until they blurred together. Doors closed. Curtains were drawn. The village settled into an uneasy quiet. By nightfall, little Hawthorne understood one thing with certainty. Harriet Bell had not simply gone missing. Something had taken her from the order of the village and, in doing so, disturbed it. And beneath the calm facades, behind the roses and the manor's old secret stirred, waiting for the chance to breathe again. By morning, little Hawthorne had transformed. The village woke earlier than usual, as though rest itself had become improper. Curtains twitched long before breakfast bells rang and doors opened with exaggerated casualness that fooled no one. News traveled faster than footsteps. By the time Mrs. Grant opened the post office, 3 separate versions of Harriet Bell's disappearance were already circulating. Some said the girl had been dismissed the night before and fled in shame. Others insisted she had been meeting a man in secret beyond the hedgerow. A few whispered darker things, lowering their voices even though there was no one close enough to overhear. Gossip did not erupt all at once. It seeped. At the butcher's shop, customers lingered longer than necessary, discussing nothing while meaning everything. At the bakery, women exchanged looks instead of words. Each glance suggested knowledge the other might not possess, or pretended to. Miss Marple noticed it all. She walked slowly through the village that morning, her pace unhurried, her expression pleasantly vague. People greeted her kindly, as they always had, yet spoke more freely in her presence than they realized. Elderly women, she had learned, were often treated as harmless furniture, decorative, familiar, easily ignored. Mrs. Whitcomb leaned toward her at the greengrocer, as stall. Such a dreadful thing, she murmured. Though I always felt there was something odd about that girl. Miss Marple smiled politely. Odd in what way, dear? Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated, clearly inventing something respectable. Quiet. Too quiet. Miss Marple nodded as though this were deeply informative. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clark dabbed her eyes dramatically over morning tea. It is a shock to us all, she said. Poor Lady Evelyn. Imagine something like this happening under one's own roof. Indeed, Miss Marple replied gently. It must be very unsettling. And yet, Mrs. Clark added, lowering her voice, one wonders how well employers truly know their staff. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Employers, she reflected, often believed servants invisible until something went wrong. By midday, Inspector Pierce had established himself in the village hall, taking statements with a patience that wore thinner by the hour. Most were eager to speak. Few were eager to tell the same story twice. Mrs. Everly insisted she had seen Harriet Smiley only minutes before her disappearance. Colonel Baxter claimed she looked pale and ill. Eleanor Fitch was certain the girl had been crying. Lady Evelyn maintained that Harriet had behaved entirely normally. Miss Marple listened from the corner, her hands folded neatly, her eyes mild. Normal, she thought, was the most misleading word in the English language. What struck her was not what people said, but how eagerly they said it. Each person seemed anxious to place the girl into a narrative that excluded themselves. Running away, secret romance, poor upbringing, anything that created distance. No one wished to be near whatever had happened. Inspector Pierce eventually dismissed the crowd, promising further inquiries. When the hall emptied, he noticed Miss Marple still seated. "Did you wish to add anything, Miss Marple?" he asked kindly. "Oh, no," she replied. "I am quite sure you will uncover everything perfectly well." He smiled, unconvinced, and left. That afternoon, visitors appeared at Hawthorne House. Some arrived under the guise of sympathy, others' curiosity thinly masked as concern. Lady Evelyn received them stiffly, her voice controlled, her posture impeccable. "I cannot imagine what possessed the girl," she said repeatedly. "She was treated fairly, generously, even." Miss Marple observed her from the edge of the room. Lady Evelyn's distress was genuine enough, but it was not fear. It was offense. To her, Harriet's disappearance was not merely troubling, it was improper. In the kitchen, the remaining staff whispered among themselves. The cook, Mrs. Alder, crossed herself whenever Harriet's name was mentioned. The gardener avoided the house entirely. The atmosphere felt thick, like air before a storm. That evening, as twilight settled again, a new detail emerged. A boy from the village claimed he had seen Harriet near the old footpath behind the hedgerow shortly before the fete ended. He insisted she had not been alone. When pressed, he became vague. A tall figure, he said, could have been anyone. By nightfall, suspicion bloomed like mildew. Some wondered about the inspector himself. Others eyed Colonel Baxter's loudness with newfound caution. A few glanced toward Hawthorne House and said nothing at all. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her window, reflected on how quickly certainty formed without evidence. People did not seek truth. They sought comfort, and comfort often required someone else to be blamed. She recalled a woman she had once known who smiled constantly while poisoning her husband. St. Another who wept so convincingly at her sister's funeral that no one noticed the relief beneath the sorrow. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, was remarkably consistent. The next morning brought a sharper edge to the village's unease. Inspector Pierce requested permission to search the grounds behind Hawthorne House. Lady Evelyn agreed with brittle politeness. The hedgerow was examined carefully. Footprints had long been trampled by fete-goers, yet something peculiar remained. A small indentation in the soil near the path, as though someone had paused there. Not briefly, but long enough to argue. Miss Marple was not present for this discovery, but she heard about it within the hour. News traveled faster when it fed fear. By midday, Harriet Bell had ceased to be a person in the village's mind. She had become a problem, and problems little Hawthorne preferred were best solved quickly. Whispers grew more pointed. Voices dropped when certain people passed. Old resentments resurfaced, attached now to a new urgency. Miss Marple watched all of it with quiet sadness. It was never the crime itself that troubled her most. It was how swiftly kindness disappeared afterward. By evening, the village no longer asked where Harriet was. They asked who had taken her, and in the soft lamplight of their sitting rooms, each resident began to construct a version of the truth that made themselves feel safest, whether it was true or not. The third day after Harriet Bell's disappearance dawned gray and heavy. the sort of morning that seemed reluctant to begin at all. A thin mist clung to the hedges and drifted lazily across the lanes, softening the familiar outlines of Little Hawthorne until everything appeared slightly unreal, as though the village itself were unsure of its own shape. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and stood for a moment at her bedroom window. From there, she could see the church spire emerging faintly from the fog. It reminded her of mornings long ago when uncertainty had settled just as thickly over the place. Villages remembered these things even when people pretended not to. By breakfast time, Inspector Pierce had returned to Hawthorne House. He was accompanied by a constable this time, a young man who tried not to look nervous as they crossed the gravel drive. Lady Evelyn received them in the drawing room, composed but cool. "I assure you," she said, "there is nothing more I can tell you." Nevertheless, Pierce replied gently, "I'd like to go over the household routine once more." She agreed with visible reluctance. The cook was questioned again. The gardener repeated his statements with increasing irritation. Everyone insisted Harriet had behaved normally, though each description of normal differed slightly from the last. Miss Marple, arriving later under the pretense of delivering a jar of homemade preserve, was invited in without hesitation. Lady Evelyn had always considered her harmless. She sat quietly near the window while the inspector spoke, appearing absorbed in her handbag as though searching for something forgotten. In truth, she listened. When Lady Evelyn described the morning of the fete, she spoke crisply, recounting the day as one might recite a rehearsed passage. Yet when she mentioned Harriet preparing breakfast, her voice faltered, only briefly, but enough. Miss Marple noted it. The gardener mentioned hearing raised voices behind the house shortly before noon. He dismissed it immediately as nothing unusual. Nothing unusual was often precisely the opposite. Later, as Miss Marple prepared to leave, she paused near the back door. "How lucky," she said mildly, "that the girl thought to take her coat. It's been so chilly." The cook looked startled. "Her coat?" "Yes," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "It was missing from her room." The cook's eyes flicked toward the hallway before she could stop herself. "Oh," she said, "yes, I suppose so, suppose." Miss Marple thanked her and left. Outside, she walked slowly along the path behind the house. The hedgerow loomed dense and dark, its branches tangled tightly together. It struck her as an odd choice for a rendezvous. Lovers preferred privacy, but not inconvenience. Fear, however, made people careless. She bent slightly, examining the ground with interest. The earth was firm now, but she could imagine how it might have looked days earlier. Scuffed, disturbed, hurried. Behind her, footsteps approached. Colonel Baxter emerged from the mist, hat pulled low. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said too cheerfully. "Out for a stroll." "Just stretching my legs," she replied. "Terrible business, this," he continued. "Though if you ask me, the girl probably ran off with someone. Happens all the time." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked softly. He laughed. "Young people are unpredictable." She smiled politely. Colonel Baxter spoke again, filling the silence. "Still, Lady Evelyn's been terribly upset." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Upset takes many forms." He frowned faintly, then laughed again and moved on. That afternoon, Inspector Pierce began speaking more firmly with certain villagers. Questions repeated. Timelines tightened. Politeness thinned. At the post office, Mrs. Grant nervously admitted Harriet had once asked about trains to the coast, though she couldn't recall when. At the bakery, someone mentioned seeing Lady Evelyn arguing with the girl weeks earlier. Every new detail contradicted the last. Miss Marple sat on a bench outside her cottage, listening as neighbors passed. Some spoke freely. Others stopped mid-sentence when they noticed her, then smiled awkwardly and moved on. She remembered a woman in St. Mary Mead who had once sworn she'd never heard a raised voice until confronted with proof. Memory, Miss Marple knew, was a flexible thing when reputation was at stake. As evening fell, Inspector Pierce visited her cottage. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Not at all." she replied, pouring tea. He accepted gratefully. I'd value your impressions, he admitted. You have a way of noticing things. Miss Marple smiled modestly. Only people, really. And what do people tell you? He asked. She considered. That they wish very much for this to be simple. Pierce sighed. So do I. They also speak more freely about Harriet than they ever did to her, Miss Marple added gently, which is often the case after someone disappears. He nodded slowly. She wasn't invisible, Miss Marple continued. She was merely overlooked. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly thinking. Fear had settled into the village now. Not loud fear, but the kind that rearranged conversations and sharpened smiles. Everyone had begun watching one another, and watching themselves most of all. That night, rain fell softly, dampening the paths and washing away what little trace might have remained near the hedgerow. Miss Marple listened to it from her bed, hands folded neatly. The truth, she reflected, rarely arrived dramatically. It crept closer while people were busy convincing themselves it never would. And somewhere within Little Hawthorne, someone was beginning to realize that silence, once so comforting, was becoming dangerous. By the fourth day, patience had begun to wear thin. The mist had lifted, but tension lingered in its place, sharper now, more brittle. Inspector Pierce moved through Little Hawthorne with a firmer stride, his questions no longer gentle inquiries, but quiet demands for clarity. The villagers sensed the shift and reacted instinctively, some with cooperation, others with defensiveness thinly disguised as indignation. It was not long before suspicion found its first convenient home. Colonel Baxter, with his booming voice and erratic temper, became the subject of increasingly pointed glances. Someone recalled seeing him near the hedgerow during the fete. Someone else mentioned an argument between him and Harriet weeks earlier about her insolence. The details grew more vivid each time they were repeated. By mid-morning, Inspector Pierce requested a private conversation with the colonel. The interview took place in the small sitting room of Baxter's cottage. Miss Marple, arriving later with a basket of knitting for the church charity, heard about it within minutes. News traveled quickest when it confirmed what people wished to believe. He was furious, Mrs. Grant whispered at the post office, absolutely livid at being questioned. That proves nothing, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Grant sniffed. Temper proves a great deal. That afternoon, Pierce spoke openly to several villagers. At present, he said carefully, Colonel Baxter is assisting with inquiries. The phrasing alone was enough. But evening, assisting had become suspected. Miss Marple observed the transformation with quiet unease. It happened so easily, relief masquerading as logic. Once a suspect emerged, the village's fear softened. Conversation resumed. Tea tasted normal again. Someone had been chosen. She visited Colonel Baxter that evening under the excuse of returning a book he had once lent her. He greeted her stiffly but allowed her inside. You don't believe all this nonsense, surely, he said, pacing. I served this country with honor. I'm sure you did, Miss Marple replied. He stopped abruptly. They think I frightened the girl, as if I'd waste my time. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. You're not afraid of being suspected, she said. You're angry. Of course I am. Anger is much easier than fear, she said softly. He stared at her, unsettled, and said nothing more. The following morning brought further complication. Inspector Pierce announced that Harriet's coat had been found. It lay folded beneath a low bush near the old footpath, placed deliberately, not discarded. The fabric was dry despite the previous night's rain, suggesting it had not been there long. The discovery electrified the village. She must be nearby. They've hidden her. Why fold it if she ran away? Speculation returned with renewed force, sharper and more accusatory. Colonel Baxter's name was spoken openly now. Miss Marple examined the coat later with permission. It was plain and worn at the cuffs, nothing remarkable, except the neatness of the fold. People fleeing do not fold coats. People staging scenes do. Inspector Pierce studied the area thoroughly. No blood, no clear struggle. Only absence. That absence weighed heavily. By afternoon, pressure mounted to act decisively. Several villagers urged Pierce to make an arrest before things got out of hand. He resisted, but only barely. Miss Marple sensed the danger immediately. When authorities feel hurried, they stop listening. That evening, she attended a small gathering at Mrs. Clark's home. Tea was served stiffly, conversation strained. "You know," Mrs. Clark said suddenly, "the Colonel has always frightened me." Others murmured agreement. Miss Marple said nothing. Later, as she walked home, she passed Hawthorne House. Lights glowed in several windows. The place seemed restless, as though it too were uneasy. A figure moved briefly in the upstairs corridor. Lady Evelyn pacing. Miss Marple paused, then continued on. The next day brought confrontation. Inspector Pierce summoned Colonel Baxter once more, this time in the presence of the constable. Voices carried faintly from the cottage. The interview ended with the colonel storming out, red-faced and shaking. By noon, whispers claimed he would be arrested by nightfall. Miss Marple felt a familiar tightening in her chest. It was all happening too smoothly. She spent the afternoon walking the village, observing not the suspect, but the watchers. Mrs. Everleigh's eagerness. Mrs. Grant's sudden confidence in her own assumptions. The way Lady Evelyn avoided every conversation that drifted too near the household. Private affairs. That evening, Miss Marple paid a brief call at Hawthorne House. Lady Evelyn received her coolly. "I trust you are coping," Miss Marple said kindly. "I am managing," Lady Evelyn replied, "though this situation has become intolerable." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Being watched is very uncomfortable." Lady Evelyn's lips tightened. "The Colonel deserves it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps the village needs him to deserve it." Lady Evelyn stared at her. Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "Forgive me. I speak in riddles." As she left, she noticed something small but unsettling. A scuff mark on the polished floor near the back hallway, faint, as though someone had been dragged or had slipped while resisting. Polish could hide many things. That night, as the village settled once more, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting forgot in her lap. The pieces were arranging themselves, not neatly yet, but undeniably, and she knew with quiet certainty that the village's chosen suspect was the wrong one, which meant the real danger still walked freely among them. The atmosphere in Little Hawthorne shifted subtly after Colonel Baxter became the village's favored explanation. It was not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it, a loosening of tension that allowed people to sleep again, to speak with confidence rather than doubt. Certainty, even when borrowed, was comforting. Miss Marple found this far more troubling than fear. She noticed how conversations resumed their old rhythms, how laughter returned too quickly, how concern for Harriet Bell faded into abstraction, replaced by speculation about procedure and punishment. It was as though the girl herself had already been reduced to a footnote. Yet beneath the surface, calm unease remained. Inspector Pierce continued his inquiries, though with increasing pressure from villagers who wanted resolution. Each day without an arrest was treated as incompetence rather than caution. Miss Marple, meanwhile, pursued her own quiet line of understanding. She began by visiting Mrs. Alder, the cook at Hawthorne House, under the pretense of delivering fresh eggs. Mrs. Alder received her stiffly, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's all dreadful," she said at once. "I never liked trouble." "Very few people do," Miss Marple replied gently. They spoke of small things at first. The rising cost of butter, the difficulty of keeping fires steady, until Miss Marple mentioned Harriet's habits. "She used to rise early," she said, "before anyone else." Mrs. Alder hesitated. She liked to finish her work quickly. "So she might have been awake before dawn?" "Sometimes," the cook admitted, "though not lately." "Not lately. She'd been tired," Mrs. Alder said, then stopped. "Tired?" Miss Marple prompted kindly. The cook's mouth tightened. "She wasn't sleeping well." Miss Marple nodded. "Poor girl. Mrs. Alder glanced toward the hallway. She said she heard footsteps at night. Footsteps? In the back corridor, she whispered. I told her it was nothing. Old houses make sounds. Old houses did make sounds, but fear gave them meaning. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Eleanor Fitch near the churchyard. The girl looked pale and anxious. You were fond of Harriet, Miss Marple said. Eleanor nodded. She was kind. Did she ever confide in you? Eleanor hesitated. She said she was frightened of making someone angry. Did she say who? No. Eleanor swallowed. But she said it wasn't the Colonel. That, Miss Marple thought, was interesting. As evening fell, she walked again behind Hawthorne House. The scuff mark she had noticed earlier remained faint but visible. A servant's hurried polishing would not remove it entirely. It suggested resistance. Inside the house, Lady Evelyn dined alone. The atmosphere was brittle. She spoke sharply to the remaining staff and dismissed them early. Miss Marple was invited briefly afterward, more out of obligation than warmth. I do hope this ends soon, Lady Evelyn said. The strain is quite unbearable. For everyone, Miss Marple agreed. Lady Evelyn's gaze flickered. People forget how difficult it is to maintain standards. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Standards can be heavy things. Lady Evelyn did not reply. That night, Miss Marple lay awake longer than usual. Patterns formed slowly in her mind, not facts, but feelings. Harriet's fear, the folded coat, the polished floor, the nighttime footsteps. Control, that was the word, rising quietly to the surface. The following day brought new disturbance. Inspector Pierce announced that Colonel Baxter would be held overnight for further questioning. The village reacted with barely concealed satisfaction. Miss Marple felt a cold weight settle in her chest. She visited the inspector at the village hall. I hope you won't mind my saying so, she said gently, but this may be premature. Pierce sighed. I'm under pressure, Miss Marple. Pressure often produces mistakes. He looked at her intently. Do you have reason to believe he's innocent? I believe, she said carefully, that he is not the sort of man Harriet feared. Pierce said nothing. That evening, as rain fell lightly again, a cry broke the stillness. A child had found something near the stream beyond the footpath. A small object, Harriet Bell's shoe. The discovery reignited panic. The villagers crowded close, voices rising. Some wept openly, others grew grimly satisfied. Proof, they said. Miss Marple examined the shoe quietly once the commotion eased. It was scuffed, but not damaged. No sign of dragging, no tearing. It had been placed there. She looked up slowly. Someone wanted the story to move forward. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting idle once more. The village believed it was approaching the truth. In reality, it was being led, carefully, deliberately, away from it. And the one who led them understood human nature far too well. The discovery of Harriet Bell's shoe changed the tone of the village entirely. What had once been speculation hardened into conviction. People no longer spoke of possibilities, but of outcomes. Tragedy, they said, must surely follow. The stream was searched thoroughly that night. Lanterns bobbing like nervous stars along its banks. Nothing else was found, yet absence itself became proof in the collective mind. Miss Marple watched from a distance as the search concluded. The men returned wet and weary, faces drawn with disappointment that bordered on irritation. They wanted something tangible, something final. Instead, they had only another object placed where it could be found. Colonel Baxter remained confined overnight, and though no charges had been formally announced, the village spoke, as though judgment had already been passed. Sympathy for Harriet sharpened into righteous anger, and anger sought direction. Miss Marple visited the colonel the following morning. He looked diminished, his earlier bluster drained away. They've made up their minds, he said bitterly. Facts don't matter. Facts always matter, she replied, but they require patience. He laughed harshly. This village has none. She left him with quiet reassurance, though she felt its fragility. That afternoon, Inspector Pierce returned to Hawthorne House once more. This time his manner was different, controlled, alert, no longer rushed. He had begun to feel the wrongness of the path laid before him. Miss Marple happened to arrive shortly after, again under the guise of neighborly concern. The back corridor smelled strongly of Polish, too strongly. Mrs. Alder hovered nervously as Pierce asked further the question. When he mentioned the nighttime footsteps Harriet had spoken of, the cook stiffened. She was fanciful, she said too quickly. Perhaps, Pierce replied. But she mentioned them more than once. Miss Marple noticed Lady Evelyn watching from the doorway, her expression unreadable. Later, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor after the inspector moved on. The scuff mark remained faintly visible beneath the shine, the sort of mark left by heels sliding suddenly on smooth wood, a struggle without sound. She bent slightly, examining it. Behind her, Lady Evelyn spoke. "You seem very interested in my floors." "They tell stories," Miss Marple said gently. "If one knows how to listen." Lady Evelyn's mouth tightened. "This house has always been respectable." "Respectability," Miss Marple replied softly, "often depends on silence." For a moment, something flickered in Lady Evelyn's eyes, not anger, but fear. It vanished quickly. That evening, rain fell again, heavier this time. The stream swelled slightly, and villagers whispered that perhaps it had already carried Harriet away. Miss Marple disagreed silently. The shoe had not been wet when found. The next day brought a second shock. Letter arrived at the post office, addressed simply to Inspector Pierce. It bore no stamp, no return address. Inside was a single line, written in careful hand. "You are looking in the wrong place." The message unsettled the village far more than the shoe had. It implied intention, awareness, control. Pierce read it twice, then sought Miss Marple. "You believe it too," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "Someone wishes to guide you. Toward what?" "Toward comfort," she said, "away from truth." That afternoon, Miss Marple made a deliberate visit to the vicarage, knowing Lady Evelyn would be present for tea. Conversation flowed stiffly until Miss Marple remarked casually on Harriet's neatness. "She folded things beautifully," she said. "Her coat, especially." Lady Evelyn's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. Miss Marple continued mildly. "A careful girl, not the sort to drop things carelessly near streams." Silence followed. Mrs. Clark attempted to laugh it off, but the moment lingered unpleasantly. Later, Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts settling into alignment. Harriet had been frightened, not of exposure but of confrontation. Someone had been exerting authority over her. Someone accustomed to obedience. The folded coat, the placed shoe, the controlled narrative, power disguised as propriety. That night Miss Marple slept poorly. Toward morning she woke with certainty rather than dread. She had seen this before, not in this village, not in this house, but in pattern, in women who believed their status justified their actions, in households where discipline blurred into cruelty, in people who mistook control for order. The following day, Inspector Pierce announced that Colonel Baxter would be released pending further investigation. The village reacted sharply. Confusion, anger, suspicion redirected. Miss Marple felt the tension shift again, dangerous and unpredictable, and somewhere within Little Hawthorne, the person who had carefully shaped events felt the ground begin to move beneath them. They had relied on the village's need for simplicity. But simplicity, Miss Marple knew, never survived careful observation. The release of Colonel Baxter unsettled Little Hawthorne more than his confinement ever had. Certainty dissolved overnight, replaced by something far more uncomfortable: doubt. People who had spoken confidently now hesitated mid-sentence. Conversations broke off abruptly when others approached. The village felt as though it were holding its breath, uncertain which direction to turn next. Suspicion, once neatly contained, spread again, this time without focus. Inspector Pierce sensed it immediately. Without a clear suspect, anxiety sharpened into hostility. He moved carefully now, knowing that any misstep would deepen mistrust rather than resolve it. Miss Marple watched the shift with quiet attentiveness. She spent that morning at the post office, listening as Mrs. Grant spoke more freely than she realized. People think too much, Mrs. Grant said. If the girl was mistreated, she'd have said something. Would she? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Grant frowned. Why would she? Because sometimes, Miss Marple replied, speaking feels more dangerous than silence. The words lingered uncomfortably between them. Later, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Alder again, this time near the garden gate behind Hawthorne House. The cook looked pale, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her shawl. You are not well, Miss Marple observed kindly. I am just tired, Mrs. Alder said too quickly. Tiredness often comes from carrying things alone. The cook's eyes filled briefly before she turned away. I've worked in houses all my life, she said. You learn when not to see. Miss Marple nodded and went to look away. That afternoon, Inspector Pierce made an unexpected discovery. In reviewing Harriet's personal effects, he found a scrap of paper tucked inside the lining of her handbag, something missed earlier in the haste. On it was written only a time and a single word, library. The village library was small, seldom used except by Miss Marple and the vicar's wife. Pierce examined the visitor log. Harriet's name did not appear, but Lady Evelyn's did, frequently. Miss Marple was informed later that evening. She said nothing immediately. Instead, she paid a visit to the library the following morning. The librarian greeted her warmly, unaware of the weight the place had suddenly acquired. Miss Marple wandered the shelves slowly until she reached the rear reading alcove, a narrow space partially hidden by tall bookcases. The chair there had been moved slightly off its usual position. She imagined Harriet sitting there, small, tense, waiting, listening. Library conversations, she knew, carried more privacy than parlors. That afternoon, she encountered Lady Evelyn near the churchyard. A dreadful time, Lady Evelyn said stiffly. All this scrutiny. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Scrutiny can feel very personal. Lady Evelyn's expression tightened. People seem eager to blame their betters. People rarely resent kindness, Miss Marple said. They resent fear. Lady Evelyn's gaze sharpened. What are you implying? Nothing at all, Miss Marple said pleasantly, but the air between them felt colder. The following evening, Inspector Pierce questioned Lady Evelyn formally for the first time. She received him with impeccable dignity. I have nothing to hide, she said. He asked about Harriet's duties, her temperament, her worries. She was overly sensitive, Lady Evelyn said coolly. Some girls are. Pierce asked about the library visits, her hand stilled on the teacup. I often read there, and Harriet, she accompanied me once or twice. For what purpose? To be corrected, Lady Evelyn said. She had become careless. Miss Marple later learned that the word corrected had been used precisely. The village reacted uneasily when word spread of the interview. Lady Evelyn was respected, even admired. The idea that scrutiny might reach her felt improper, almost obscene. She's a benefactor, Mrs. Clark insisted. She's done so much for the village, others echoed. Miss Marple found herself increasingly isolated in her quiet certainty. That night, she walked again behind Hawthorne House. The garden lay still, moonlight glinting faintly off wet leaves. Near the old footpath she paused. Something new lay half hidden near the hedge. A small ribbon, pale blue, frayed at one end. She recognized it instantly. Harriet had worn it often in her hair. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely noted its position carefully. Someone was becoming careless or desperate. The next day, Inspector Pierce received yet another anonymous message. You're closed. Don't stop now. This one unsettled him far more than the first. Miss Marple understood why. The messages no longer redirected him. They urged him forward. Someone wanted discovery. Someone wanted release. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a final visit to Hawthorne House. She spoke kindly with the staff, asked nothing directly, observed everything. Mrs. Alder avoided her eyes. Lady Evelyn's composure cracked just slightly when Miss Marple mentioned Harriet's ribbon. I don't know why you keep dwelling on these trivialities, she snapped. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Trivial things," she said, "are often where truth hides." As she left the house, Miss Marple felt the certainty settle fully at last. The village had not lost Harriet by chance. She had been silenced, not in rage, not in panic, but in the cold, controlled moment when authority feared exposure. And now the person responsible was beginning to unravel beneath the weight of their own careful order. By the 8th day, little Hawthorne no longer pretended to be peaceful. The village moved with caution now, voices lowered even in open spaces, doors closing more firmly than before. People avoided Hawthorne House without quite admitting they were doing so. Respect had begun to fracture, and what replaced it was far more dangerous. Uncertainty mixed with resentment. Inspector Pierce worked longer hours, his fatigue visible. The anonymous messages troubled him deeply. Whoever sent them was neither frightened nor reckless. They wrote with intention, shaping events carefully, watching his reactions. Miss Marple understood the pattern well. People who feel power slipping often test the limits of control. That morning she visited the vicarage, knowing Lady Evelyn would arrive shortly for her usual donation discussion. She positioned herself near the window, knitting quietly. Lady Evelyn entered with crisp movements, her posture rigid. "I must say," she declared, "this situation has become intolerable. My reputation is being questioned." "Reputation," Miss Marple said mildly, "is a fragile thing when it rests upon silence." Lady Evelyn stiffened. "I have done nothing wrong." Miss Marple looked up gently. "Then there is nothing to fear from honesty." The words landed heavily. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made a deliberate decision. She sent a message to Inspector Pierce, requesting a private conversation that evening. They met in her sitting room as dusk gathered. She served tea, as always, her hands steady. "I believe," she said calmly, "that Harriet Bell is not dead." Pierce stared at her. "What makes you say that?" "No sign of violence," Miss Marple replied. "No blood, no torn clothing. Only carefully placed objects." "You think she's being hidden?" "I think she was confined," Miss Marple said, and moved. Pierce's brow furrowed. "By whom?" "Someone with authority. Someone whose control is habitual, not emotional." He said nothing. "She feared confrontation," Miss Marple continued. "She spoke of footsteps at night. She sought privacy at the library. She prepared to leave, but not suddenly. She wanted protection." "Protection from whom?" Pierce asked quietly. Miss Marple met his eyes. "From Lady Evelyn." The silence that followed felt heavy but necessary. Pierce exhaled slowly. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Which is why it must be handled delicately." She proposed a simple plan, not accusation but observation. That night, Pierce requested a final meeting with Lady Evelyn under the pretense of clarifying inconsistencies. Miss Marple was present, seated quietly near the fire. Lady Evelyn entered with controlled grace. "This is becoming harassment," she said sharply. Pierce spoke calmly. "We've received information suggesting Harriet Bell intended to leave your employment." "Nonsense. Then you won't object to us searching the unused wing of the house?" Her composure faltered just slightly. "There's nothing there," she said. "It's been closed for years." "Then the search will be brief." Her lips thinned. "I refuse." Miss Marple spoke softly. Refusal often creates suspicion. Lady Evelyn turned toward her sharply. "You have no authority here." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but I do understand people." Pierce watched closely. Lady Evelyn rose abruptly. "This is outrageous." She moved toward the door, then stopped. The sound came faintly through the house. A cough. Soft. Human. Miss Marple's eyes lifted instantly. Pierce froze. Lady Evelyn's face drained of color. No one spoke. The sound came again. Unmistakable. Pierce moved swiftly down the corridor, followed by Miss Marple. The unused wing smelled of dust and cold stone. At the far end, a door stood closed, locked. Pierce tried the handle. "Open it." Lady Evelyn stood rigid behind them. "There's nothing inside." Pierce forced the door. The small room beyond was dim, barely furnished. On a narrow bed lay Harriet Bell, thin, pale, alive. She flinched at the sudden light, shielding her eyes. Miss Marple moved forward at once. "It's all right, my dear." Harriet began to cry, not loudly, but with exhausted relief. Lady Evelyn sank into a chair, her control finally shattered. "She was going to ruin everything," she whispered. "She accused me, said she'd tell." "What?" Pierce demanded. "She claimed I frightened her," Lady Evelyn said bitterly, as though discipline were cruelty. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "You locked her away." "I only meant to teach her silence," Lady Evelyn said faintly, "until she calmed down." "How long?" Pierce asked. "I don't know," she whispered. "Time lost meaning." Miss Marple looked at Harriet, who clutched her hand tightly. Control, once seized, rarely knows when to stop. As dawn approached, Harriet was taken safely from the house. Lady Evelyn remained seated. Her elegance collapsed into something small and frightened. The village would awaken soon, and when it did, nothing in Little Hawthorne would ever appear quite the same again. Morning arrived in Little Hawthorne with an unfamiliar stillness. Word had not yet spread fully, but something in the air had shifted. The birdsong sounded sharper, the lanes quieter, as though the village sensed that its long-held balance had finally tipped. Curtains twitched earlier than usual, and faces appeared briefly at windows before withdrawing again. Harriet Bell was taken to the doctor's house just after dawn. She walked slowly, supported on either side, her steps tentative but determined. Her face was pale, eyes shadowed, yet there was unmistakable life in her. A few villagers glimpsed her from doorways and froze in disbelief. "She's alive," someone whispered. The words traveled fast. By mid-morning, the truth had begun to ripple outward, hesitant at first, then unstoppable. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Expressions shifted from triumph to embarrassment, from confidence to shame. Those who had spoken most loudly against Colonel Baxter now avoided his gaze entirely. Inspector Pierce remained at Hawthorne House, overseeing the formalities. Lady Evelyn had not slept. She sat rigidly in her drawing room, staring at nothing, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had whitened. When questioned again, she spoke without resistance. "She exaggerated everything," Lady Evelyn said weakly. "I never intended harm." "You can find her," Pierce replied calmly. "Against her will. She was hysterical. She was frightened," he corrected. Miss Marple, seated quietly nearby, watched not with triumph but with sadness. She had seen many women like Lady Evelyn, raised to believe authority was righteousness, obedience a moral duty. When that belief cracked, it often shattered violently. By noon, villagers gathered in small clusters along the green. No one organized it. Curiosity pulled them together. They spoke in murmurs, glancing toward Hawthorne House with expressions that blended shock and denial. Mrs. Clark dabbed her eyes repeatedly. "I can't believe it," she kept saying. Lady Evelyn, of all people. Miss Marple stood nearby, hands folded. "People are often capable of what we least expect," she said gently. "And Harriet," Mrs. Grant whispered. "Will she be all right?" "With care," Miss Marple replied, "and kindness." That afternoon, Inspector Pierce addressed the village briefly. His voice carried clearly, though he chose his words carefully. "Harriet Bell has been found alive. She is safe. An arrest has been made. No names were spoken. They were unnecessary." A murmur swept through the crowd. Disbelief, shame, relief. The village dispersed slowly afterward, each person retreating inward to examine their own part in what had happened. Some recalled words spoken too confidently. Others remembered moments they had chosen not to say. Colonel Baxter stood alone near the edge of the grin. Miss Marple approached him quietly. "I'm sorry," he said gruffly, not quite meeting her eyes. "For what?" "For nearly believing them myself." "That is very human," she said kindly. He nodded once and walked away. At the doctor's house, Harriet rested beneath clean blankets. The doctor insisted on quiet, nourishment, and time. Miss Marple was allowed to sit with her briefly. Harriet's voice was thin but steady. She said I was ungrateful, Harriet whispered, that I embarrassed her. When I said I'd leave, she said I couldn't. Miss Marple held her hand. You were very brave. Harriet shook her head weakly. I was so frightened. Bravery often feels exactly like that, Miss Marple said. Outside, the village resumed movement cautiously. Life attempted to return, but it did so unevenly, like a limb that had not yet healed. Lady Evelyn was taken away quietly that evening. There was no spectacle, no shouting, only a carriage at the drive, and a figure seated stiffly within it. Miss Marple watched from a distance. She felt no satisfaction. Justice, she knew, was not a thing that brought joy, only balance. As night fell, Little Hawthorne settled once more into silence, but it was no longer the comfortable silence of denial. It was thoughtful now, reflective. In her sitting room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The familiar rhythm soothed her. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed. Fear still masqueraded as virtue. Power still convinced itself it was right, but occasionally, just occasionally, observation and patience were enough to restore what had been broken. Outside, the roses stood quietly in the dark, their petals untouched, their thorns unchanged, and Miss Marple, ever gentle, ever watchful, prepared herself once more for a world that would never stop needing her kind of attention. The days that followed settled over Little Hawthorne with a strange mixture of relief and discomfort, like sunlight after a storm that reveals more damage than expected. Life resumed outwardly at least. Shops reopened at their usual hours. The church bells rang on Sunday with their familiar steadiness. Teacups clinked again on saucers. Yet beneath the routines lay a quiet awareness that something fundamental had shifted. The village had looked closely at itself and had not entirely liked what it saw. Harriet Bell remained at the doctor's house for several days. Strength returned slowly, carried by warm broth, clean linens, and the gentle reassurance of people who now spoke to her as a person rather than a servant. When she finally walked through the village again, heads turned not with curiosity this time, but with something closer to remorse. Some smiled too quickly. Others avoided her eyes. Miss Marple walked beside her part of the way. You needn't hurry, she said softly when Harriet slowed. I'm afraid I might still be in trouble, Harriet admitted. No, my dear, Miss Marple replied. You are no longer invisible. That makes all the difference. Inspector Pierce completed his report with care, mindful not only of fact, but of the fragile dignity of a village that would have to live with them. Lady Evelyn's actions were recorded plainly. Unlawful confinement, intimidation, abuse of authority, stripped of sentiment or excuse. There was no dramatic confession, no moment of villainous rage. Only the slow unraveling of a woman who had believed order gave her the right to control others. When Pierce visited Miss Marple one final time, he looked both exhausted and thoughtful. You were right from the beginning, he said, about the village choosing comfort over truth. It is a very human tendency, she replied. And about Harriet not being dead. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Death is noisy in its own way. Silence is much more frightening. He hesitated. You never accused Lady Evelyn directly. No, Miss Marple said. People rarely listen when accused. They listen when allowed to reveal themselves. Pierce nodded slowly, understanding at last. In the weeks that followed, Little Hawthorne adjusted itself. Some relationships cooled. Others strengthened quietly. The villagers spoke less freely of certainty and more carefully of assumptions. It was not a transformation, exactly. Villages were slow to change, but a soft correction, like a stitch pulled tighter where fabric had begun to fray. Colonel Baxter resumed his walks, his voice no longer booming quite so loudly. Mrs. Grant grew gentler in her observation. Mrs. Alder left Hawthorne House and found work elsewhere, carrying both guilt and relief with her. Harriet chose not to remain in the village. On her final afternoon, she visited Miss Marple's cottage to say goodbye. She stood in the doorway, posture straighter than it had ever been before. I'm going to the coast, she said. My sister has friends there. "That sounds very sensible," Miss Marple said. Harriet hesitated. "You believed me before anyone else did." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I believed what people showed me. That's all." Harriet smiled, then left, not hurried this time, not afraid, but purposeful. When she was gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. Outside, the village moved as it always had. Children passed on bicycles. A dog barked in the distance. Life continued, imperfect, persistent. Yet Miss Marple knew something important had been revealed, even if it would never be spoken aloud. The crime had not been born of rage or desperation, but of entitlement. Lady Evelyn had not seen herself as cruel. That, Miss Marple reflected, was the most dangerous thing of all. When people believe they are right, they stop questioning what they do to others. Authority becomes morality. Control becomes kindness. And that was why Harriet had been locked away, not in hatred, but in righteousness. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. It was a pattern she had encountered many times across her long life. Different houses, different faces, same quiet certainty that power knew best. She rose and placed the yarn back in its basket. Outside, roses climbed once more along the garden trellis, their blooms perfect and fragrant. Visitors would admire them again next spring, praising little Hawthorn's charm and order. They would not see the thorns unless they looked closely. Miss Marple did, and she always would. Because evil, she knew, rarely announced itself with darkness or fury. More often, it arrived politely, convinced of its own correctness, and waited for someone patient enough to notice.